darkness, sailor, day is at hand. See o'er the foaming billow fair heaven's land. Drear was the voyage, sailor, now almost o'er. Safe within the lifeboat, sailor, pull for the shore.
Miss Christy Ann Morrison stood on the dock in her best wool dress, her hair smooth and becomingly arranged, her carpet-bag and satchel carefully packed with her overnight things, and she watched the Northern Belle sail away without her. She had promised her mother that she would take the Northern Belle. The Belle had run the North Shore route for the past 7 years. Everybody knew her and trusted her crew. Now this Asia she'd never even heard of. The man said that they brought her up from the canals after the Manitoulin had caught fire. She hoped that the captain knew about more than canals. She'd have to take the chance. When the Asia arrived at last, around 11 o'clock, she was merrily blowing her whistle, lamps lit on every deck. High above, Christy Ann could even hear fiddle music and singing. Her adventure was beginning. At the top of the gangplank stood Captain John Savage, in a dark suit with a flat peaked cap on his head. He was a small but imposing man with a shock of dark hair, dark eyes, and one of the fullest beards she'd ever seen. He greeted her courteously, and he welcomed her aboard. She would have liked to explore, but just then the whistle blew again, and the 2 men pulled up the gangplank, and a lady's maid appeared to escort her to her stateroom. She followed her up the steep stairs and down a long hall to the ladies' quarters. The woman opened one of the doors to reveal a room just wide enough for 3 berths. The double berth was already occupied. There was a young woman with a pale, round face and freckles who sat up in the bottom. She was introduced as a Miss McNabb, and above her was Miss Legg lying down. The smell of the kerosene lamp did not cover the fact that both had already been seasick. When the maid left, Christy Ann put down her carpet-bag and her satchel, and she opened the small window in the door. But then she remembered her manners, and she asked the ladies if there's anything she could do for their comfort. Miss Legg moaned and asked her to pass the basin. It was going to be a long night. She must have dozed a little, because the next thing she knew it was light. She'd been dreaming that she'd been riding in the back of the wagon, but as she opened her eyes, she could hear that it was still raining outside quite hard, and the sensation that she'd felt in her dream was really the ship pitching from side to side. Timbers were creaking and moaning as it moved, and a sound of retching came from the next room. Her head ached and her stomach was lurching. Hopefully fresh air would help. She dressed and she went out onto the deck, and she was hit by a blast of wind as she opened the deck door. She could hear the rigging slapping against the mast and the sound of the hull as it rose and then crashed over waves taller than she was. Cousin John was walking towards her on his way up to the hurricane deck. "Where are we?" she asked. "We're almost to the Gap. We'll be out of the shelter of the Indian Peninsula soon and headed for Manitoulin Island." "Is the weather supposed to clear?" "I'm afraid we're in for a rough passage. The barometer's falling. It looks like we're due for a storm." By 9 a.m., the crew ordered all passengers into the cabin. The boat had moved into the most open part of the lake. The winds, no longer restrained by the Bruce Peninsula, roared, and the waves crashed over the deck. Christy Ann had never even imagined waves like this. Some of them were at least 2 stories high. In her stateroom, Christy Ann could hear the crewmen tramping back and forth outside. She could hear the scrape of something dragging overhead and the desperate squealing of horses. There was a crashing and a splashing, and her carpet-bag slid back and forth across the floor. Outside, The noise was terrible. There was human screaming and crying over the shrieks of the wind. She blocked her ears with her hands and she closed her eyes. The boat heaved and plunged, pitching wildly in the waves. Suddenly she was thrown onto the floor and the room seemed to tip right over. They were going down, and then the boat seemed to right herself, and the floor was more or less straight, and it was better, until Christy saw water coming in under the door. She pushed it open. Water rushed in, and Miss McNabb pushed past her, followed by Miss Legg. Water was streaming down the hall. She waded through, headed for the deck. In the next room, women with children were still sprawled on their beds. "Get up! We're sinking!" They only moaned. There was no time to stop. People pushed past her, grabbing at her clothes and her hair. She began to climb the ladder up to the hurricane deck, with people grabbing and pulling her back. Ahead she could see the railing, and beyond that, the water. Christy Ann climbed up on the railing, held her breath, and jumped.
Light in the darkness, sailor, day is at hand. See o'er the foaming billow, fair heaven's land. Drear was the voyage, sailor, now almost o'er. Safe within the lifeboat, sailor, pull for the shore.